Hey everybody. So today what we're going to look at is phrasal verbs. We're going to look at phrasal verbs today, and I know everybody hates phrasal verbs. Phrasal verbs seem to be the things that really flip students out more than any other thing in grammar, but I promise, don't panic. We're going to look at different ways of making phrasal verbs a little more manageable today. Okay? What is a phrasal verb? Well, a lot of times in English, you often see combinations of verbs plus prepositions or verbs plus adverbs. And a number of books seem to think that any combination of a verb plus a preposition after is a phrasal verb. Okay, but we'll see that it's actually not quite the case. And if you think about them in a specific way, it actually makes them easier to remember. Okay, so first of all, what is a phrasal verb? Valid question. Let's start with talking about what a phrasal verb is not. If you take the verb talk, for example, you know from experience that there are a couple of different prepositions or adverbs that you can use after talk, depending on what the object is. You can talk to somebody, you can talk about something, or if you're talking about a topic of discussion, you can talk something over with someone, especially if you're trying to find a solution. But there's an issue with that. It doesn't change, those three combinations do not change the basic idea of talk as verbal communication. So technically, talk to, talk over, and talk about, they're not phrasal verbs. They are verbs that use different prepositions or different adverbs depending on what comes after, but they don't change the meaning of talk. Okay, and this is a really important litmus test. If the meaning of the original verb does not change, it's not a phrasal verb. It's a verb with a preposition. But if the verb actually does change when you add different prepositions to it, then yes, it is a phrasal verb. And I'm sorry, I'm going to use a bit of a rude example in English, but it's probably the verb I know that illustrates this the best. I don't want to offend anybody. I'm just going to call it the F word. You know what word I'm talking about. I just don't want to have problems with YouTube about this. Okay? That word usually has an idea of something about sex, sexual contact, sexual conduct. But if I put certain adverbs or certain prepositions after it, it changes the original meaning of it. Take a look at these examples in the next slide. If I talk about, for example, effing around, I'm talking about wasting time. It has nothing to do with sex. It's just the idea of losing time over something that's probably pretty stupid. Similarly, if I'm talking about effing with someone, I'm not talking about having sex with them. I'm talking about bothering them or irritating them or not being straightforward with them. Again, there's no idea of sex in the meaning. Similarly, if I'm talking about effing someone over, it usually has nothing to do with sex. It's about money. It's about wealth, because the idea is to cheat or deceive someone. And you notice that in all three of those examples, the original verb changes because none of those phrasal verbs are related to sex or sexual content. And that's the idea of a phrasal verb. Not that it makes it any more correct to use, but it's not sexual. Okay, so to summarize, if it's a verb plus a preposition, or if it's a verb plus an adverb, and it doesn't change the meaning of the verb, talk still means talk, for example, or go still has the idea of movement, it's a verb with a dependent preposition. And you can tell what the preposition will give you an idea of what the subject is. For example, To has the idea of moving from one place to another. About usually has the idea of a topic. In contrast, when it's a verb plus preposition, a verb plus an adverb, or a verb plus a preposition plus an adverb, or a verb plus an adverb plus a preposition, and the idea of the original verb changes, then it's a phrasal verb. And especially if you're using most English-only dictionaries, that's why the phrasal verbs are at the end of the entry of the verb, so that you don't confuse it with the original meaning of the verb. Okay? So, remember, if the base meaning of the verb, if the original meaning of the verb has changed, it's a phrasal verb. Okay? So, your next question is, how do you deal with phrasal verbs? What are the most efficient ways of studying phrasal verbs so that you can remember them and use them in the future? First thing to remember, don't freak out. And yes, freak out, that's a phrasal verb in English. Okay? Phrasal verbs are just vocabulary. It's the same thing as learning a joke. It's the same thing as learning a collocation. It's the same thing as learning somebody's name. It's a bunch of pieces that go together. The second thing to remember is that you have to think of the phrasal verb as a unit of meaning. In the same way that Angelina Jolie is a unit of meaning, or Coca-Cola is a unit of meaning, it's the same thing with phrasal verbs. You don't think of the individual parts, you think of them as a unit together. The piece is made up of all the different parts. And that's really important because what happens is that bad students or students who are just beginning to work with phrasal verbs will try to translate each individual part and they won't get it right for one of two reasons. They either assume that there is a literal meaning to the phrasal verb, or they're so fixated on the parts they don't think about how the complete unit works together. And good students, you work with the whole unit. They work with the whole expression, exactly the same way you do when you're learning someone's name. The final piece of advice, limit the number of phrasal verbs that you try to learn. This is the reason why in secondary school, if your teacher gave you a whole bunch of lists of phrasal verbs and you don't remember what those phrasal verbs are, that's why you don't remember them. It's just random. That's like trying to memorize 25 credit card numbers. Some people can do it, but most of us can't because it doesn't have a context. So limit the number of phrasal verbs that you try to learn at one time. And that way, once you start thinking of the contexts and you limit the phrasal verbs to the phrasal verbs that you're going to learn, that you're actually going to use in your life, you realize that it's not necessary to learn every possible phrasal verb, especially right now. I don't even know how many phrasal verbs there are, but what I tell students is limit it to the number of phrasal verbs and limit it to the contexts that you're going to need. For example, phrasal verbs for going to the pub, or maybe phrasal verbs that are related to money. Because if it's important to you, then you're going to be able to remember what it is, just like any other piece of vocabulary or just like any other piece of information. If you try to memorize too much, you won't use it. So, I hope you found that video helpful. Again, like always, please feel free to visit the blog, which is stop-spanglish.blogspot.com, or if you'd like more information about classes and seminars, www.stopspanglish.com.